They wore laurel wreaths and jeweled crowns, but beneath the gold their bodies were failing. This is not a tale of battlefield glory. It's the slow, humiliating collapse of rulers who tried to command death and were ignored. In this first part, 5 monarchs fight a losing war against illness, poisoned at table, rotting by inches, or trapped inside minds turned against them. Watch what happens when absolute power meets absolute frailty. Our countdown begins in ancient Rome with Emperor Claudius, a ruler who overcame ridicule to lead an empire, only to be undone by illness and intrigue. Claudius was the unlikely successor of the notorious Caligula. As a child, he limped, drooled, and stuttered, leading the Roman court to dismiss him as a weakling or a fool. Modern historians suspect he may have suffered from cerebral palsy or a nervous disorder, conditions unrecognized at the time. The young Claudius was kept out of sight, mocked by his own family, and never expected to rule. But in 41 AD, after Caligula's assassination, the trembling middle-aged Claudius was found cowering behind a palace curtain, and to everyone's surprise, hailed as the next emperor of Rome. Once in power, Claudius proved far shrewder than anyone anticipated. Despite his physical ailments and the cruel whispers at court, he passed wise laws and even conquered Britain, expanding the empire's reach. The Romans, who had laughed at him, now respected him, but even as he ruled successfully for 13 years, his health remained frail. He was frequently ill and fatigued, and his awkward gait and slobbering mouth never fully went away. Some courtiers still snickered that their emperor was a half-wit held together only by the royal robes. In the end, Emperor Claudius met his demise not on the battlefield, but at his own dinner table. By age 63, his health was in decline, and so was his grip on those around him. Claudius's fourth wife, the ambitious Agrippina, was determined to see her son Nero inherit the throne. According to ancient chroniclers, Agrippina served Claudius a platter of mushrooms laced with deadly poison. The emperor, unsuspecting, devoured his favorite mushrooms and soon collapsed into violent illness. He foamed at the mouth, trembled with convulsions, and was carried to bed in agony. As his life hung in the balance, Agrippina's conspirators supposedly administered a final cruel touch. A feather dipped in poison slid down the emperor's throat to ensure he stopped breathing. Claudius died in terrible pain, allegedly murdered by his own wife. The gruesome end of Claudius paved the way for one of Rome's darkest chapters. With Claudius gone, Agrippina's son Nero ascended to the imperial throne. The Roman world soon learned that the death of the gentle, sickly Claudius had cleared the path for a true nightmare. Nero's reign would be marked by tyranny, fire, and blood, a tragedy for Rome made possible by Claudius's untimely and suspicious death. In hindsight, the ailing Claudius's demise reminds us how even a wise ruler's fate can be sealed by the treachery within his own household. At number 9, we have King James VI of Scotland and the First of England, the king who united the crowns of 2 kingdoms, but lived his life in constant fear and sickness. James was an intelligent monarch. He sponsored the King James Bible translation, yet he was also plagued by paranoia and grotesque ailments. Small and sickly, James suffered from arthritis and chronic gout that left him hobbling in pain. He endured fierce stomach cramps and gallstones that no court physician could cure. As he aged, he grew feeble and swollen, often racked with abdominal distress. But perhaps most bizarre was James's aversion to water. The king was so terrified of bathing that he almost never washed his body. Filth clung to him, and his courtiers whispered that any room he occupied soon swarmed with lice. James would sometimes simply rub his hands with a damp cloth instead of ever properly bathing. He feared water might make him ill or vulnerable to disease. Ironically, this poor hygiene likely worsened his health issues, but James's fears were not easily overcome. James had reason to be fearful. He grew up amid plots and threats. He was the son of the ill-fated Mary, Queen of Scots, and from a young age he believed witches and dark magic were out to harm him. In 1590, when a storm nearly sank the ship carrying him and his new bride home to Scotland, James became convinced it was the work of witches. This incident sparked James's lifelong obsession with witchcraft. He personally oversaw witch trials, interrogating suspected witches, and even authoring a treatise on demonology. Throughout his reign over Scotland and England, beginning in 1603 in England, he lived in constant paranoia, not only of witches, but of assassins and plots. The Gunpowder Plot of 1605, where Catholic conspirators attempted to blow up Parliament, deeply intensified his anxieties. James wore thick padded clothing to protect himself from knife attacks and was often seen glancing over his shoulder. As the years went on, King James's body began to betray him. The gout twisted his joints until walking was excruciating. His legs and feet swelled. Courtiers sometimes had to carry the moaning king upstairs. He also suffered bouts of kidney stones, jagged stones that would pass painfully, causing him to scream in agony and void blood. His digestion was perennially poor. James would clutch his stomach after meals, doubled over from cramps and diarrhea. Physicians bled him and dosed him with foul concoctions, but nothing truly cured his maladies. The king's mind deteriorated alongside his body. His paranoia deepened. He saw threats in every shadow. Even water itself, the source of life, seemed like a sinister element to James. He avoided bathing so much that his skin was caked with grime and his hair infested. Once, a lady of the court lamented that sitting in a chamber frequented by James left her lousy, crawling with lice. The stench around the king was said to be overpowering. James's infirmity and fear had a noticeable effect on his rule. His paranoia fueled witch hunts that terrorized both Scotland and England. Under his watch, hundreds of innocent people, mostly women, were accused of witchcraft, tortured, and executed, all to appease the king's dread of the supernatural. His inability to trust others also led him to rely on male favorites at court, breeding resentment and political infighting. By the end of his life, King James was a weakened figure, frequently bedridden and babbling in delirium from fever. He died in 1625 after a severe bout of dysentery and probable stroke. Britain was relieved to move on, but the legacy of James's fears lived after him. The witch-hunting mania he stoked would continue to blaze for decades. King James VI and the First's reign stands as a cautionary tale of how a ruler's personal demons, his illnesses and terrors, can shape an era's history for the worse. Our next tale of a ruler destroyed by illness takes us to the glittering halls of Constantinople. Emperor Justin II of the Eastern Roman Byzantine Empire began his reign in 565 AD as a confident, capable leader. But Justin's story would not be one of triumph. Instead, it descended into nightmarish madness. In his youth, Justin II was known as a devout Christian and a dutiful ruler, the nephew and successor of the great Emperor Justinian. Yet only a few years into his reign, darkness fell upon Justin's mind. He began to show signs of mental breakdown, what we might now recognize as a form of severe mental illness, perhaps triggered by stress or genetic factors. As pressures mounted, barbarian invasions, wars on the Persian frontier, religious conflicts, Emperor Justin II snapped. He became afflicted with bouts of insanity so severe that the chronicles of the time record terrifying episodes. Justin II's madness grew gradually, then rapidly. At first, he experienced mood swings and insomnia, but soon the emperor was overtaken by wild psychosis. In the throes of his illness, Justin would howl and laugh uncontrollably, and then collapse into eerie silences. He became convinced that invisible demons were tormenting him. Servants whispered that at meals the emperor would suddenly let out blood-curdling screams at the sound of church music echoing through the palace. On other occasions, he lunged at those nearby and tried to bite them like a rabid animal. It's recorded that Justin would sink his teeth into attendants and guards if they came too close, snarling in a frenzied state. The once proud ruler's eyes grew wild and vacant. The imperial court was horrified and desperate to calm the mad emperor. They resorted to a peculiar remedy. Justin was strapped into a mobile throne, essentially a wheeled chair, and rolled through the palace corridors whenever his rages peaked. The constant motion, they hoped, might soothe him like a baby rocked in a cradle. He was also fond of music at times. One chronicle claims the court musicians played gentle organ melodies day and night in an attempt to pacify his frenzied mind. For a while, these measures did bring some peace. Imagine the bizarre sight in the Golden Palace, the most powerful man in the Eastern world, tied to a rolling throne, being pushed by nervous courtiers as haunting organ music echoes off the marble walls, all to prevent him from hurting himself or others. But the respite was temporary. Justin's lucid intervals grew shorter and his madness more pronounced with each passing month. Eventually, Emperor Justin II became completely incapable of ruling. In 574 AD, in a rare moment of clarity or under the guidance of his concerned wife, Empress Sophia, Justin II acknowledged his incapacity. He adopted his general Tiberius as his son and co-ruler, effectively abdicating power while still alive. An extraordinary move prompted by his illness. Justin lived on for a few more years in a state of mental darkness until 578 AD, when death released him from his torments. His personal collapse could not have come at a worse time for the empire. The Byzantines were in a fragile position, threatened by enemies on all sides. Justin's insanity weakened the empire's leadership at a critical moment. The Persians and Avars took advantage of the chaos during his reign to seize territories. The financial reserves that Justin had zealously guarded were spent by his successor to stave off invasions and bribe foes, undoing years of careful policy. The empire survived, but only just, and the seeds of future crises were sown. Emperor Justin II's reign is remembered not for victories or laws, but for the tragic spectacle of a ruler whose mind unraveled on the throne, reminding all that even the imperial purple offered no protection from the most devastating of illnesses. Even the grandest king on earth cannot escape the woes of the flesh. King Louis XIV of France, known as the Sun King, reigned for an incredible 72 years in unparalleled opulence and splendor. He was the very symbol of absolute monarchy, a man who compared himself to the sun in brilliance. Under Louis XIV, France stood as the mightiest nation in Europe. Courtiers bowed to him in the glittering hall of mirrors at Versailles, and armies marched at his command. Yet for all his glory, Louis XIV in his final years became a spectacle of decay, a mortifying reminder that kings are mortal. The ailment that struck down the Sun King was both humiliating and horrifying, an anal fistula and later gangrene that literally caused his flesh to rot while he still lived. It began innocently enough. In 1685, Louis, then in his late 40s, developed a persistent pain in his posterior that he could not ignore. This pain grew into an anal fistula, essentially an abscess and infected tunnel near the royal rectum that would not heal. The Sun King, who loved riding and hunting, suddenly found himself unable to sit comfortably or even ride a horse due to the agony. The infection caused constant fever and discharge of foul pus, and the king's exquisite silk breeches often needed changing due to leakage from the fistula. A shocking indignity for a man who had always presented himself as majestic and infallible. For months, Louis suffered in silence, too embarrassed to allow a surgeon near his backside. Finally, as the infection worsened and the stench became noticeable in the royal chambers, he consented to a risky surgery. In 1686, a bold surgeon devised a special scalpel and operated on Louis's anal fistula in a highly publicized procedure. Courtiers waited anxiously for news, as the king was cut in a most delicate spot without any anesthesia. To everyone's relief, the surgery was declared a success and Europe rejoiced, even composing songs. It's said the melody that became God Save the Queen/King was originally to celebrate Louis's recovery. The Sun King's pride was restored for a time, but this was not the end of his suffering. Fast forward to 1715. Louis XIV is 76 years old, teeth gone, hair thinned, his once robust body now frail and pained by gout. In August of that year, he felt a sharp pain in his left leg. A black spot appeared on his skin. Doctors first assumed it was sciatica or a minor ulcer, but the treatments did nothing. The blackened area spread rapidly. Gangrene had set in, likely due to a blocked circulation or untreated diabetes. The flesh of the Sun King's leg began to die and rot. Within days, the rot spread from his foot up toward his knee and thigh. The palace was overwhelmed by the putrid smell of decaying flesh as Louis lay in bed, his leg quite literally decomposing while he was still alive. Courtiers who once flattered his beauty now gagged at the odor in his bedchamber. Louis, ever proud, tried to maintain composure, but the pain was beyond excruciating. His physicians, at a loss, applied poultices and performed more bleedings. Nothing stopped the infection. Pieces of necrotic tissue sloughed off, leaving open sores swarming with flies. The king, once the embodiment of living glory, was now a living corpse, suffering delirium from septic fever. He reportedly faced death calmly, saying, "Why do you weep? Did you think I would live forever?" On September 1st, 1715, Louis XIV finally succumbed to the gangrene, just 4 days shy of his 77th birthday. His death ended the longest reign of a monarch in European history. The spectacle of the Sun King's demise was discussed all across Europe. For decades he had been seen as nearly superhuman in power and longevity. Yet in the end, his body failed him in the most grotesque way. Foreign observers and French subjects alike took morbid fascination in how the mighty king rotted away at the end, as if it were a divine judgment or a symbol of the rot that endless wars and extravagance had brought to France. Indeed, Louis left France exhausted and debt-ridden from his wars, and the suffering of his final days almost served as a metaphor for the decay of the old order. The Sun King's agonizing death reminded everyone that no amount of wealth, divine right posturing, or royal ceremony can exempt a man, even a king who called himself the Sun, from the flesh's decay. Europe watched the spectacle of Louis's last days with a mix of pity and grim satisfaction, and the legend of the Sun King was forever tempered by the gruesome reality of how he died. Kings and queens are often called mad by their frustrated subjects, but in the case of King Charles VI of France, the nickname was all too literal. Charles VI, who ruled France in the late 14th and early 15th centuries, is remembered as Charles the Mad, a ruler whose mind fractured into insanity, leaving his kingdom spiraling into chaos. Early in his reign, Charles was known as Charles the Beloved for his youthful optimism and the hope he gave to France. But that hope would shatter in a series of horrific mental breakdowns. Charles's madness manifested in bizarre and tragic ways, including the famous glass delusion, the belief that his body was made of glass. His ailment was likely a form of severe schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, though medieval people had no name for it. Whatever the cause, the king's psychosis turned the tides of history during the 100 Years' War. The first major incident came in the summer of 1392. Charles VI, then in his mid-20s, was leading a procession of knights through a forest on the way to Brittany. He was under stress. An assassination attempt on one of his friends had unsettled him. Suddenly, a leper or a madman, accounts vary, appeared by the road and shouted, "King, ride no further, turn back!" "You are betrayed." Though the man was chased off, the words struck a chord in Charles's agitated mind. Shortly thereafter, one of Charles's own pages accidentally dropped a lance, which clattered loudly against a steel helmet. The sudden noise acted like a spark in a powder keg. King Charles went berserk. He drew his sword with a crazed look in his eyes and began swinging at those around him, screaming that traitors surrounded him. In a frenzy, he attacked his own knights, slashing wildly. His loyal companions were caught completely off guard. Several were struck down by the king's blade before others managed to tackle Charles and disarm him. The royal entourage realized with horror that their king had lost his wits. After this episode, Charles fell into a catatonic state, not recognizing his wife or his children. Although he recovered his senses months later, the psychosis returned in waves throughout his life. At times, King Charles forgot his own name and didn't know he was king. On other occasions, he would run howling like a wolf through the halls of his palace or hide in terror from invisible enemies. The most famous symptom was his delusion that he was made of glass. Charles became convinced that his body was fragile like glass and could shatter at a touch. In one pitiable attempt to protect himself, he wore reinforced clothing, even iron ribs in his garments, to prevent shattering. He forbade people to come near him or touch him, and he would sit motionless for hours to avoid breaking. Imagine the court of France, forced to treat their king as if he were a delicate glass figurine, tiptoeing around him in fear. Charles VI's reign coincided with a crucial phase of the 100 Years' War between France and England. But with the king incapacitated by madness, France was essentially leaderless. Factions of nobles and royal relatives vied for control of the government, sparking a brutal civil conflict between the king's cousin, the Duke of Orléans, and the king's uncle, the Duke of Burgundy. This infighting greatly weakened France. In 1415, the English, under King Henry V, seized the opportunity and won a devastating victory at Agincourt, in part because France's leadership was in disarray. During Charles's lucid intervals, he would sign treaties or make decisions, but when insanity struck, he could not recognize even his own seal. In 1420, in one of the most tragic outcomes of his madness, the disoriented Charles VI was persuaded to sign the Treaty of Troyes, declaring Henry V of England as heir to the French throne, disinheriting Charles's own son. The treaty effectively allowed the English to occupy northern France. Charles VI, in his madness, had unwittingly signed away his kingdom. When Charles VI finally died in 1422, still mentally unstable to the end, France was in a ruinous state. The English king's infant son, Henry VI, technically inherited the French crown, while Charles's own son, crowned Charles VII by his supporters, had to claw back his birthright over the coming years, aided by Joan of Arc and others. France's woes during this period can be directly traced to Charles VI's illness. His inability to rule left a power vacuum and a legitimacy crisis that nearly allowed France to be conquered. The people suffered dearly in war and chaos, while their king battled phantoms in his mind. Charles VI's story stands as one of the most tragic examples of royal mental illness. A king literally thinking himself made of glass, while his country shattered under the strain of war and anarchy. From poisoned mushrooms to rotting flesh and cracked minds, these 5 rulers show how quickly a crown can turn into a curse. But the descent only gets darker from here. In Part 2, the mad king who lost America, a bewitched Habsburg, a swollen Tudor tyrant, a leper who led from a litter, and finally, the Tsar whose sickness helped drown a nation in chaos.